And the thing is, even if some of the earlier papers, a number of papers, many of them coming from this tradition of looking at the negative side of cannabis, they basically, they found that cannabis has a negative effect on brain morphometry, especially in young people. So, what we found was the opposite.
Welcome to High Five with Dr. Igor Grant, Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Director of the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego. Each episode will take you on a fascinating journey into the evolving world of medicinal cannabis, as Dr. Grant poses 5 thought-provoking questions to his guest, uncovering their personal journey and unique contributions to the field. Now, here's your host, Dr. Igor Grant.
I'm Igor Grant, a director of the CMCR, and today I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Kent Hutchison. Dr. Hutchison is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of Colorado Boulder, and he heads the NIDA-funded Rocky Mountain Cannabis Research Center there. He also co-leads a number of funded studies on how cannabis products purchased in Colorado, including flower, edibles, and concentrates, affect cognition, anxiety, and pain. He also has an interest in CBD products, THC-only products, and their combination, and other things as well. He's also established a very unique mobile pharmacology lab that perhaps he can tell us about. So, first of all, Dr. Hutchison, Kent, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, just before we start, would you mind saying a few words more about your background, how you became interested in studying cannabis?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is actually one of the things that resonate with people, right? Because for me, I was a traditional substance use research kind of a guy, right? Going back to the late 90s, my work focused on cannabis, on alcohol and nicotine, only more recently getting into cannabis. And really the motivation for the move from alcohol and tobacco to cannabis was sort of a personal thing. My mother, who at the time was in her early 70s, came to me right around the time that cannabis was legalized in Colorado and said, hey, no matter what I take for my pain, it's not helping. And the things I'm taking are actually hurting me, right? I thought, she's lived in Oklahoma, right? And there was no legal cannabis in Oklahoma at that time. In fact, it was highly illegal. So she said, can I come to Colorado and maybe try something? And she said, what do you know about it? And I said, I don't know anything about it. So in fact, most people didn't know anything about it, right? And if you talk to any physician, they would tell you, we don't know what to say, right? So I said, sure, come out here. And she came out here and I sort of worked with her for some time on this. But the most important point here, though, is that it inspired me to think about how can we do research that will help inform people about the risks and the potential benefits, right? And up to that point in time, it was all about the risks. The research, as you know, Igor, it was like, it was pretty much all focused on the harm and not all focused on the potential benefits, right? And I think what my mom wanted, and what people wanted was to know, what are the risks? What are the potential benefits, right? So they can weigh the risks and the benefits. And this is going way back. This is like 10 years, but that was really the reason I got into this area in the first place. So a little bit personal, but I think it's good for people to know that piece of the puzzle.
I think with many researchers, there are personal dimensions to why we do the things we do. Thank you
Exactly.
for that. Well, let's get into, we're going to talk primarily about a very interesting study that you and your colleagues did, in which you reported that lifetime cannabis use was associated with larger brain volumes in some regions of the brain, something which is usually thought of as a healthier thing. And then greater lifetime use was linked to better performance in learning, processing speed, short-term memory, cognitive tests like that. Now, as you know, other reports have suggested that cannabis use might be associated with worse brain function. So what are your thoughts about these observations? And maybe you could begin by saying this was a very large study that you did. Maybe just describe that briefly and then comment
Yeah.
on what you think.
Yeah, so for sure, I'll start with the most recent publication, and it was with a very large data set. So this publication you're referring to basically relied on the UK, United Kingdom Biobank data. And what the UK has done is basically they put together an enormous data set on health in general, right? Part of that data set asks questions about cannabis use. And as part of the data set, they also have MRI scans on many of these people.
So these are brain imaging, right?
Brain imaging, yeah, so we can look at the brain. These data are publicly available. You have to apply to work with the data, but it's for any scientist who wants to work with it. And so, yeah, they have all these data available. And I should say also, it's in an aging population, right? So they started collecting data. Maybe when these people are in their 50s and 40s, and now we have data on people in their 70s and even early 80s. So we can look at these data and say something about an association or lack thereof between cannabis use and brain morphology. So the shape of the brain and how much gray matter and white matter there is. And also they have a lot of cognitive tests as well. So the advantage of this data set is it's really large, right? It's like there's a lot of power to look at these associations.
So is that, excuse me, was it like hundreds of thousands of people or
Tens of thousands, tens
tens
of
of
thousands.
thousands? Tens of.
So, in the like 30,000 kind of range. And so of those, about 5,000 had used cannabis. And so we basically we're able to look at that and say something about the 5,000 who used cannabis versus the controls who didn't. Now, I will say that, again, that the methodologically speaking, there are other ways to do this kind of work that perhaps have more rigor, but the huge sample size was a big advantage, right? And the thing is, even if, as you pointed out, some of the earlier papers, a number of papers, many of them coming from this tradition of looking at the negative side of cannabis, they basically they found that basically cannabis has a negative effect on brain morphometry, especially in young people. So what we found was the opposite. And the thing is, even if there are methodological issues with this, right? I think that it's definitely opposite of what a lot of people believe. So so even if we're not, this study probably is not convincing on its own of the veracity of the finding that cannabis use is associated with better brain function and better cognition. Um, you know, but it's hard to argue the opposite, right? Because we didn't find the opposite. We found that the thing that you wouldn't expect, right? And so I think that's important. And so I told you I would start with the most recent study, because actually this is consistent with things we've done in the past. Also, looking at brain structure and cannabis use, finding that certainly in some areas of the brain, cannabis use seems to be associated with increases in gray matter density, gray matter volume. And so I think it's not a finding by itself by any means. Yeah, but I also want to point out that there is we're talking about an aging population in this study and some of my prior studies, and a lot of people have been focused on adolescents and the brain, and I think there is some there even if cannabis does not impact the brain structure, brain function in a negative way, obviously there are some potential harms, right, and potential risks for young people in terms of education and being able to focus at school and things like this. So I don't want to like come across that, oh, it's like always good for you. It's good for your brain. I think there are probably some big differences between young people and older people. And we know there's some differences actually in the endocannabinoid system between young and old. I know we might talk some more about that, later in the podcast. But yeah, so I'll stop there because you asked a question that probably you thought would generate a shorter answer, and you got a really long answer. But I could talk for hours about this. So I let you lead in terms of the questions.
Well, I think the related question, and you've alluded to this about adolescent use, is you also have data on that from this study, and what were your observations there?
Yeah, so we also looked at whether. So some of the papers that have come out in the last few years have suggested that any use during adolescence has potentially a negative impact on brain function, right, and brain structure, that's like a little hard to believe because the adolescence and the brain is pretty resilient, right? It's pretty resilient, and so 1 or 2 or 3 times using cannabis, it's hard to believe that will change the brain and change future outcomes, right? So people who 30 years later, 40, 50 years later, they seem to be actually have better cognition and better gray matter volumes, right? And again, we've also looked at this going back now 10 years in other papers, and we did not find any negative impact of adolescent cannabis use in terms of the brain. And when we looked at some meta-analyses, we also found that if you combine all the studies, you really don't have much of an effect there, much of a so I think individual studies can find negative effects in adolescents. When you combine all the data, it's not as clear. Of course, as you know, Igor, we have this now giant study in the United States looking at adolescents ABCD, and we should have a really and with really good methodology, will know, I think, in the next few years whether there's evidence of that or not, and also, what kind of moderating factors might be involved in terms of predicting who has a negative effect and who doesn't.
Right. Just for our listeners, ABCD is a very large study that has begun evaluating kids. I think the earliest is age 9 or 10, something like that. And then they do repeated evaluations. So the idea is evaluate these kids with brain imaging and cognitive tests before they start any kind of experimentation with drugs, and then keep following them. So it's a very important study. But having mentioned that, we recently discussed one report that came out of that study actually, again, found correlations cross-sectionally between, say, beginning cannabis use in these kids and certain kinds of brain volumes and such. But then when they looked back, those differences were there to start with.
Exactly.
So an alternative hypothesis always is that maybe if you have a different brain to begin with, that inclines you to use of these drugs. So it's kind of this chicken egg question all the time.
Yeah, reverse causation for sure.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. Now, also, this wasn't on my formal question list, but as you know, there's been a lot of thought about whether some cannabinoids actually have neuroprotective effects because they may be antioxidants and maybe have other kinds of functions. Has your work touched on any of that by any chance?
Yeah, for sure. We're currently running a study looking at basically CBD plus THC or just CBD in terms of like the aging, mild cognitive impairment in an aging population, so older adults. We don't have the results yet from that, but that's exactly the hypothesis, right? That there might be something different about the aging population and cannabinoids, whereby cannabinoids might somehow interact with these processes in the brain that are, probably related to the development of impairment in future Alzheimer's disease, right? So that there is some sort of potential anti-inflammatory effect in the brain from cannabinoids that could be beneficial. So I think that's actually one of my favorite studies right now that we're doing. I'm super excited about seeing the results, right? Because this is a very controlled dosing. It's only a small amount of THC, a large amount of CBD, and whether that has any positive impact in these individuals who have some evidence of mild cognitive.
Yeah. And it's very interesting. As you may know, a lot of our work actually examines these cognitive and other issues in people with HIV, some of whom, of course, use cannabis and some of whom use other drugs like methamphetamine.
Hmm.
And in terms of the cannabis, using people with HIV, well, first of all, backing up, HIV itself can lead to mild cognitive impairment, probably during this because of this process you mentioned of neuroinflammation. It turns out that people who, in our studies at least, who use cannabis who have HIV actually perform a little better on cognitive
Hmm.
tests than those who use methamphetamine perform worse. But if they also use cannabis, they do better. So this is, again, kind of indirect evidence of what you're talking about. There may be these protective actions, particularly in people who have a condition that may not be good for them in the first place. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so you mentioned endocannabinoid system. First of all, do you want to say what that is, just very briefly?
Yeah. So basically, we all have a system. Basically, endocannabinoids are binding to receptors in the body and the brain. The same thing that THC binds to, and the same thing that CBD interacts with. And so the system's present already. One of the interesting things about the endocannabinoid system is that it changes dramatically with age. And so, basically it peaks during adolescence. And then, like, for example, CB1 receptor is the primary receptor, cannabinoid receptor, peaks during adolescence and then goes down. And I think I've read somewhere something like, 50% lower by age 50, right? So currently my endocannabinoid system is very different than it was when I was 16, for example, right? And so that's one of the reasons we think, that THC and CBD and other cannabinoids may have a very different impact in the aging population versus adolescents, and it's very important to study the impact over the lifespan.
Right. So yeah, so these endocannabinoids are internal signaling or communication molecules, right?
Mhm.
Who happen to act a bit like the plant compounds THC. Of course, they weren't designed in order to accommodate the plant, but well, there's many examples where botanicals kind of uh, piggyback onto
Okay,
what is normal signaling. Yeah,
okay.
so that's interesting. Um, and you mentioned these changes with aging. Yeah, that's an unfortunate thing. A lot of things, yes, kind of start going down as you age, including our number of neurons and things like that.
Exactly.
So, what do you think about the use of cannabinoids then in older people? You sort of touched a little bit on.
Yeah, I think it's to me it's very interesting, because I do think that probably the effects are different. Probably the risks, some of them are different for sure, and possibly lower in the aging population. So, for example, as when we've seen this in other studies too, that in terms of cognition and so forth, in terms of the acute effects, they don't seem to be as strong in the aging adults. However, if you think about it, though, aging adults have some vulnerabilities, right? And this is where you have to be careful. So, for example, I've seen a couple studies, and I'm sure you have too, recently, looking at emergency room admissions, emergency department admissions, right? And talking about how that when they look at older adults who were admitted for a cannabis related reason, that they have some other conditions, right, and perhaps greater cognitive impairment. And that's a tough one too, right? Because I feel like, again, we talked about reverse causation, and it's entirely possible that in this situation, well, if you think about older adults who are using cannabis, why are they using it? Well, they're using it because they're in pain. They're using it because they can't sleep. They're using it for anxiety. They're not using it to get high. In fact, getting high is probably an unwanted side effect, right? So when they end up in the ER, it's probably because they have other issues that they were using cannabis for in the first place. They didn't necessarily. It's not that cannabis was causing those problems; they were using cannabis to try and self-medicate those problems. Having said that, though, I think it's tricky because the aging population does have some vulnerabilities, and other medications, right? So they're using other medications, and maybe they're either more prone to dizziness or falls or whatever, right? So I feel like there's a kind of a different set of risks there, but certainly not the same as adolescents, right? So yeah,
Yeah. So, as you point out, the impacts and trajectories may be entirely different.
exactly.
It should be said, though, I guess, I don't know what you think about this, but it's true older people get put on more and more meds for various things, but those things also have their own side effects and risks. So sometimes people say, well, you shouldn't give, say, THC to older people because this and that could happen to them. But people don't talk about the alternatives. So
Exactly.
that if you can control pain with a low dose of THC, just as an example,
Right.
is that better or worse than taking an opioid or some other kind of medicine?
Yes, absolutely. When I talked about earlier about how older adults, like, when they want to know what the risks and benefits are, right, of cannabis, it's actually more complicated. They want to know what the risk and benefits of cannabis are compared to the risk and benefits of whatever, an opioid or something else, right? And that's really important, right? Because one might be less risky than the other one, right? And so it's important to know that. Yeah. So one of the outcomes in our studies that we look at is polypharmacy, right? So, like, when people start using cannabinoids, are they reducing the other medications they're taking, right? Because maybe they're on a sleep medication, an anxiety medication, different, pain medication, and nausea medication, right? And so the question is, some of those people who are using cannabinoids, are they using less of the other medications? That's, I think, an important question as well.
Right. And there has been some research to suggest that to be true, that there is reduced use of opioids and maybe benzodiazepines, things like that, the tranquilizer type. Yeah, right. I know. Could I turn to another kind of theme here? Because you've also looked, I believe, at the acute effects of cannabis on the subjective experience of aerobic exercise. This is a little bit of an advertisement for our listeners, but CMCR is actually hosting in the fall a symposium on cannabis and sport. So it's timely, and they can get to it at cmcr.ucsd.edu. But anyway, so tell me about your work in this area.
Yeah, so that's something I've been interested in forever, going back, from the very beginning of this line of research. And it turns out some grad students were interested in it also, and also colleague Angela Bryant is very interested in this, in the sort of exercise part side of this. Yes, the study you're referring to, it was a kind of a very controlled attempt to look at what impact does cannabis have on in terms of exercise. The impetus for this was that a lot of people report using cannabis while they exercise or after they exercise, right? So before or after. And, in the context of going to the gym or weight training or, aerobic training. And so we wanted to try and do something in a experimental, controlled kind of a way. And so basically in a nutshell, the finding was that, it does seem to impact how people like the positive emotions that people feel when they exercise, but also, and kind of on the other flip side of that, it has some negative impact in terms of the experience of exertion, that people feel like they're exerting they have a little bit higher exertion levels and when they're using, for example, THC in combination with exercise, but also they have higher positive affect. And so the study was kind of a mixed bag and probably raises more questions than it answers. But it's a very interesting field because when you talk to even like more elite athletes, especially, I'm thinking of like ultra marathoners, right? And reading about their experiences, like trying to dampen down the nausea and things like this, toward the end of an ultra marathon. There's interesting stuff going on out there. I feel like we certainly would be a good thing to do more research. And this is one of those areas where though it's hard to get funded, right? People want to fund research on, whatever, a neuropathic pain after chemotherapy, but funding something on like, ultra marathon is a little less fundable, right? So, but I think very interesting. So, yeah.
So when you said about exercise, I guess the subjective experience of the exercise, can you say more about that? So are you saying people feel more tired, less tired, but have a better mood, or can you just say a little more?
Exactly. They start saying that their perceived exertion is higher, right?
Okay.
But their positive emotion is higher too.
They feel better about it.
Yeah, exactly. So, it could be something like, if you think about it too, it may even be a side effect. If you are, for example, smoking cannabis, right, and then you exercise, even that might make the exercise feel a little bit harder, right, because of the inhalation part of it. I'm just speculating here, right? But so it might not be the THC, it might be the actual act of smoking. On the other hand, though, you have the control conditions they were smoking also, so maybe not, right? But the point is, yes, there's a kind of a mixed bag, right? So, greater positive emotion, also greater perceived exertion during
Right.
the exercise.
Well, and of course, these cannabinoids, THC particularly, do have cardiovascular effects as well. So
Exactly.
they may make the heart work harder, for example, or could be lowered blood pressure and things like this.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the other area when we've talked to athletes is that they use it after their sport, whether it's football, rugby, especially contact sports where where you really feel pain afterwards.
Exactly. Very
Yeah,
true. Very true.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's another area.
Yeah.
All right. Well, our time is kind of moving to a close. I'm just wondering if there are any other things you would like to comment on that's interesting in the work you're doing, things we haven't covered.
Yeah, I honestly, I feel like again, covered most of the things that I'm very excited about this mild cognitive impairment study. It's funny, working with the older adults, they are so, in some ways, so much better to work with because, they're very curious. They want to know more. They're very engaged in the research. And I feel like we're going to learn something from this study, right? I'm very excited about those results, which we won't have in for maybe another year. But we've had great recruitment, great participation. And I feel like, and of course, we have great biomarkers for looking at the progression of Alzheimer's, pre-Alzheimer's, right? So these biomarkers are related to some of the mechanisms involved. And so I think we're going to get some really interesting results. Maybe it'll be nothing, right? But if there's something there, I think we'll hopefully be able to find it. So yeah, I'm excited about that.
Well, good. We'll look forward to that. So, I've been speaking with my friend and colleague, Dr. Kent Hutchison from Colorado, about his work in the area of cannabis, and particularly this very interesting set of studies that raise questions about the common narrative that cannabis basically is mostly bad and creates a lot of bad things for the brain, particularly, and noting that may not be the case. And of course, that makes total sense because virtually every medicine, every chemical can have positive effects. It can have negative effects. Depends on how much you use and the person and all of those things. So thank you for reminding us that things are complicated.
Great.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'll be talking again, I'm sure.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Igor. Have a great weekend.
Take care.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. For more information on the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego, please find us on social media, including Twitter/X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and other social media platforms, or visit our website at cmcr.ucsd.edu. Thanks for listening.